This is part one in a very short mini-series on the School of Hard Knocks. You're probably familiar with that phrase, the School of Hard Knocks. It's about education that comes through difficult and unpleasant life experiences. It's adversity versus university, right? Instead of going off to a formal school, the university of whatever, where you pick whether or not you're going to enroll and you choose your courses and you pay your tuition. This is the School of Hard Knocks. This is the school of adversity. You don't enroll. It comes looking for you. It decides it's time for you to learn. And you do pay. You pay with your perseverance. You pay with your suffering, usually, right? It's adversity. Way back in 1918, there was a little quip in the Peninsula Enterprise newspaper. I ran across it this week. Whoever put it in there said this: much of our education is to be obtained only in the School of Hard Knocks. And there's no age limit, and the sooner we are graduated, the better for us. All of that seems to be true, right? Much of our education is to be obtained in the School of Hard Knocks. There are lessons you can't seem to learn anywhere else, or if you learn them, you don't learn them, right? It's like the difference between, sometimes we'll say your head versus your heart. Like, when it's in your head, yeah, okay, you know it, but when it's in your heart, when it's in your life experience, then you know it. And they said there was no age limit. Isn't that the case? And the sooner we graduate, the better for us. Yeah, for sure. None of us want to be in the School of Hard Knocks because it hurts so much and it's so painful and costly. The School of Hard Knocks isn't just a thing for people who won't learn any other way, or a thing for people who can't afford to go away to college and so they have to learn it all on their own. It's not just that. It's a Christian thing too. Every New Testament writer acknowledged the role of suffering in developing Christ-like character. The character that you and I want, that God wants for us, such things like refined hope, perseverance, unshakable joy, genuine love, those kinds of things, they come, we learn them through suffering. And every New Testament writer talked therefore about it. The Apostle Paul, James, and John, and Peter all talked about how important suffering is and what our attitude towards suffering should be, because the School of Hard Knocks, aka suffering, produces these things that you can't learn any other way. Jesus is a master teacher in the School of Hard Knocks. He's a master teacher. He knows exactly what to teach us and what experiences will be required in order for us to learn that. How best we learn, right? He knows us. He knows the lessons. He knows the timing. He knows it all. He is a master teacher in the School of Hard Knocks. And if you've been a Jesus follower for a while, you've probably experienced that. And maybe you're in the School of Hard Knocks right now and you're experiencing it right now. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about a time when he and his companions who were with him doing missions work together were in the School of Hard Knocks. And we can benefit from his experience, so we're going to take a look at what he had to write. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to jump in at verse 8. Paul says, "We don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of our affliction that took place in Asia. We were completely overwhelmed beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life itself." There's a ton packed into that sentence, isn't there? He says, we want you guys to know the trouble that we experienced when we were in the province of Asia. That would be modern-day Turkey. That word he uses for trouble is a word that usually means troubles, plural. Affliction. It wasn't just like, okay, we had a hard time with something. It was troubles. It was one thing after another. You catch that in the next phrase. He says, we were completely overwhelmed. You get the idea there's like one thing after another thing, after another thing, and after another thing. And maybe you could have borne up under one, but not the cumulative total, and not at the pace at which these things were coming. Paul doesn't tell us exactly what those things were. But he tells us instead the effect that it had. He says, we were under great pressure, far beyond our power to endure. Like, it exceeded what we could cope with. You've probably heard the expression, God won't give you more than you can handle. I think Paul would have said, oh, that's rubbish. Like, we could handle maybe this much. It was like this much. We were just like pounded. It was way, way, way beyond our strength, way beyond our ability to handle. And he said it was so bad that we even despaired of life itself. Like sometimes you might say things like, man, I'm not sure I'm going to survive this. Paul said we were in the school of hard knocks, and we were in so hard of a lesson that we really didn't know if we were going to live. As a matter of fact, we came to the conclusion that we were pretty sure we weren't. Look at verse 9. He says, indeed, we felt that we'd received the sentence of death. We felt in ourselves that we were going to die. Like this is how it ends. This is over for us. You know, Paul wrote this at a time when the Roman Empire was in its full glory, and they had, you know, justice where it was, you know, really came down to a magistrate or a judge or whatever, or the emperor. And the same kind of thing could happen in the arena where maybe a gladiator had been there and he'd done something, and the guy in charge is trying to decide, am I going to let this guy live or not? And so he'd hold out his hand like this. And then if he decided to let the guy live, and you remember the guy, his life is entirely in the hand of the man with his hand like this. If the guy decided to let this gladiator live, he'd put his hand up like this. But if he did like that, put it down. That was the death sentence. You're going to be executed within seconds. And Paul said, this thing, this affliction, these troubles that they were under that were so overwhelming, he said, we felt like we had received the death sentence from God. Like when we were praying and we were crying out to God, God, are we gonna make this? God, are you gonna deliver us from this or not? He says we felt like God was silent, and God's silence was like the thumbs down. No, you're not. This is how it ends for you. I'll see you in heaven soon. Paul continues, second half of verse 9, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. Whoa! This is the mind blower if you don't know this passage already. You're like, whoa, whoa. None of this was an accident? No, it wasn't an accident. All this affliction, all this trouble, all this overwhelming, even the sense he's going to die, none of this was an accident. It came on purpose because it had a purpose, and then Paul lists out the purpose. So, whoa, this is School of Hard Knocks Extreme Edition. By the way, I've got some graphics here on the screen. These graphics have some free lessons you can learn through reading rather than the School of Hard Knocks. The lessons on the side, they don't really have anything to do with the lesson that Paul learned or that we're going to try to learn. It's just free stuff. Paul says, we were suffered affliction, right? That's verse 8. We were overwhelmed. We thought we were going to die, and God allowed us to believe that. God allowed us to believe that we were going to die. All that was done on purpose, so that we would rely on the one who raises people from the dead. We thought we were dead, so that we would learn to rely on the one who raises people from the dead rather than on our own ability. And he doesn't even really say what it was the own ability to do, whether maybe it was, he's like, God taught us this so that we wouldn't rely on our own ability to manage life's adversity, or we wouldn't rely on our own ability to figure out how to solve the problems we were in, or we wouldn't rely on our own ability to do the ministry and the work that God had given us. He doesn't really explain to us what it is that the temptation was, their own ability that they would rely on. He just says, listen, all this happened so we'd rely on God who raises people from the dead rather than on ourselves who are about to die. And if you hear that, you might be thinking, whoa. I mean, like I said, this is Extreme Edition, School of Hard Knocks, right? Was this really necessary? When Paul says, all this happened so that we would learn to rely on God rather than ourselves, maybe that doesn't strike you as like being that big of a deal. Like self-reliance doesn't seem like a big deal. Like if Paul's like, all this happened because we were sinning big time, and that's what it took for us to quit, maybe we'd be like, oh, okay, nod our head up and down, okay, I don't like it, but that makes sense. Paul says all this happened because self-reliance is that big of a deal. And we're like, really? I mean, really? Is self-reliance that big of a problem? Was this really necessary? Obviously, God thought so. Pause and just let that sink in for a moment. God thought that self-reliance was big enough of a deal in Paul's life and in Paul's companion's life, his fellow co-workers, ministry folks' life, that God brought all of this, brought them to the point that they thought they were going to die and really believed that they were going to die. Some might be thinking, whoa, isn't self-reliance a good thing? I mean, doesn't it keep people from having like an entitlement mentality or a victim mentality? Doesn't it make people take responsibility for their lives, because they're relying on themselves. Like, like we got that expression in English, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like, rely on yourself. Don't trust everybody else. Don't depend on everybody else. Do it. Take responsibility for yourself. Get up and do it. Isn't self-reliance a good thing? I would be quick to say self-reliance is very motivational. And motivation can lead to amazing results. But there are other, better ways for God to motivate us and produce amazing results. And self-reliance has a very, very dark shadow side, as we're going to see in just a minute. So, is self-reliance that big of a deal? God obviously thought so. One reason I think God thought so is because of this. Self-reliance is misplaced hope. Self-reliance is misplaced hope. This is what he got into. He's like, listen, we are normally inclined to, with our human nature, we're normally inclined to put our hope in ourselves in some way. Versus the reliance that God wanted us to have was where we rely on God. Our hope is placed in God. Our ability to be okay comes from God. Our ability to survive, even if it means death, comes from God. Self-reliance is misplaced hope in at least three ways. Number one, misplaced hope is unreliable hope, right? Self-reliance is a misplaced hope, and that misplaced hope is an unreliable hope. It puts the hope in us, and that hope will disappoint when you need it the most. And that's devastating, right? Anytime you have misplaced hope, when does it hurt the most? When you needed it the most. When we lived in Portugal, we were well aware that we lived on a fault line. We're also very much aware that Portugal has had a couple earthquakes in its past. The city of Samora was pretty well wiped out, not once but twice, due to tidal waves from earthquakes. And so we were always encouraged to have a couple things. One is a go bag, because if there's an earthquake, you got a little bit of time before the tidal wave gets you, but not a lot, right? And so we were told that you have a go bag, have things packed and ready so that you can just go. So your important documents, some money, maybe food, fresh water, those kinds of things. The second thing that we were told to have prepared was our escape routes. Figure out, how do you get to higher ground that doesn't depend on you crossing a bridge, because if there's an earthquake, the bridge may have been damaged or destroyed. And so, I wasn't super excited about doing it, but I did. We put together a go bag. I figured out through biking, actually, where were the places where they didn't have bridges on the way out of town, and where was, according to my elevation thing, where are the highest points for the next 5, 10, 15, 25 miles, that kind of thing. And then as I told Mara, I'm like, listen, if something happens, grab the kids, grab this, throw it in the van, get to here, right? Now, that was a waste of time, sort of, because during our time there was one earthquake, but it wasn't a severe one, no tidal wave. But our hope wasn't placed in, well, I sure hope we don't have an earthquake. Our hope was placed in our planning. If my hope had been placed in, well, there won't be another earthquake while we're here at least, when would that hope have proven to be unreliable? When we had an earthquake. And at that point, when I needed that hope to be true the most, is when I would have found out just how unrealistic and unreliable it was, and that would have been devastating, right? We would have lost my family. Now, other examples. Maybe that's not where your hope is. Maybe, you've put hope in a friend that you're just really hoping that friend, you're trusting, believing that friend will be there for you when times get tough. And then times got tough. And when you needed the friend the most, you didn't have their help, right? When you needed that hope the most, you found out it was unreliable, and that was devastating. Let me get really serious for just a moment. Immediately after death, countless people go to hell because they place their hope either in the belief that there isn't an afterlife or in the belief that there are other ways to get to heaven other than Jesus' sacrifice. And when it mattered the most, right after death, their hope proved to be an unreliable hope. Misplaced hope is unreliable hope. Second, misplaced hope is an unreliable compass. A compass, it points you to certain things. Misplaced hope does that. It points you, but it points you and me to the wrong actions. It says, do this. Here's where relief will come. Here's what you ought to do. You try harder, or try to always maintain control, even if it's an illusion, right? Maintain the illusion of control, because at least you won't feel anxious that way or something like that. Misplaced hope points us to actions, but they're the wrong actions versus the ones that we're going to see that Paul took when we get to part 2 in this mini-series. Paul turned to God and he turned to community. Third, misplaced hope is a thief. It's a thief. It will rob us of resurrection power because we're depending on the wrong thing when we depend on our own power and our own strength instead of God's power and God's strength. We get robbed of the power that could be available to us. Resurrection power, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, Paul says, is available to you and to me if we are Jesus followers. It'll also misplace hope as a thief in another way. It'll also steal God's glory. The thanks that he's due. Romans chapter 1 talks about that. The reality is this. You and I are dependent upon God for physical and spiritual life. Right? Spiritual life, for sure. I think we see that easily. But physical life, too. Right? If God doesn't let you breathe, you don't live. If God doesn't let your heart go, beat, 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 you don't live. So that's just reality. And so misplaced hope, like it all comes down to me, and I can do it, and I'm the author of my own life story. That's a thief. It steals reality from us. And then we steal glory from God when we don't admit that God is the one that we're dependent on and give him the thanks. So as we go through this mini-series, we're actually following 2 threads. Self-reliance and the School of Hard Knocks. So let me wrap our time up by handling them separately. Number 1, self-reliance has a dark shadow side. It's what we've just been talking about. That shadow side is so dark that God decided to take Paul to school over it. That shadow side is so dark that he will take us to school in order to set us free of it. Next week, we're going to talk about how to do a hope reset if you realize you put your hope in the wrong things. In preparation this week, you might want to just do a hope check, right? Check. What or who are you relying on? When push comes to shove, what or who are you relying on? Number 2, the School of Hard Knocks. If necessary, God will use significant pain to teach us life-giving lessons. If the lesson is vital enough and life-giving enough, God will take us to the School of Hard Knocks to teach it to us. Now, friends, please hear, he doesn't ask us to enroll. I don't find anywhere in scriptures where God's like telling you and me, listen, go ask and say, God, in your prayers, God, would you please bring adversity into my life today? Because I want to learn something. I just want to learn something. So bring some adversity in. He doesn't ask us to enroll, but he does ask us to graduate. He does ask us to stick with him and learn, go with him and let him teach us. He does ask us to graduate. Many years ago, when I was my first day of middle school. I remember this. I lived in a very small town, and all of the students in our town would go to and gather at the front steps of the little fire hall there. And at the appropriate time, a school bus would come. It'd be empty. It'd pick up all of us and then haul us the 10 miles off to the school that we were now going to go to. Middle school, we were going to the big school. Right? And so here we are. Every kid in our town, grades 6 to 12, is all gathered, just waiting there, no supervision, which is an interesting concept nowadays, waiting for the bus to come. And there was this kid, and somebody else pointed him out to me and said, "Oh, that kid, yeah, he comes the first day of school every year, and then he drops out after that." And this kid heard what the other kid had said to me about him. And he said, "Oh, it's true." And then he uttered these words. He said, "If you're smart enough to know that you need to go to school, you're smart enough and you don't need to go to school." So he said, "Every year I know, I'm smart enough to know you should go to school. So I come on the first day of school, and then after that, I realize, hey, if I knew I needed to come to school, I'm plenty smart enough already, and I don't need to go to school. And so I drop out, so I come the first day every year, and then I drop out after the first day. Attend one day, drop out, because I'm smart enough." Huh. I think there's a flaw in that logic somewhere. When it comes to school of hard knocks, we want to graduate, we don't want to drop out. Dropouts, at best, miss out. Right? Dropouts miss out on the lesson that God wants to teach them. Dropouts miss out on the freedom that God wants to give them. Dropouts miss out on the character that God wants to develop within them. Dropouts miss out on the hope and that could be theirs and the joy that could be theirs. Dropouts miss out. And so God looks at you and me when we're in the school of hard knocks and says, listen, stay in until you graduate. Friends, if you're in a season of suffering, I want to encourage you. Stay in, graduate. Ask God to reveal the lesson and to help you to learn it. We'll pick up here in part 2.